Hey guys, I'm Sam Anderson, product manager here at Cane Creek Cycling Components. And today we're going to talk about the HELM's internal travel adjustment. So I have my own personal fork here from my own bike, and we're going to be increasing the travel from 160 to 170 millimeters. So the first step, take the fork off of the bike. Second step, put the fork face down on a table in a protective manner. So the first step when taking the fork apart is to make sure that there's no air left inside of the system. So the first thing that you want to do is reach down to the bottom of your fork, take off the protective cap that is on your air spring side, and then unthread your negative equalizer chamber. This allows the air from the negative air spring to flow out of the top of the fork. So now that we have the negative air spring available, the top of the fork straighter valve can be released with air while holding the button on the bottom. This ensures that all the air is coming out of both the top and bottom of the fork. So the next step is removing the lowers from the uppers. Now before you do this, make sure that there's no air still left in the air chamber. What you're going to do is take a 13 millimeter wrench and loosen the compression rod nut on the air spring side of the fork. Now you don't want to completely remove the compression rod nut just yet. Leave it on the assembly until we remove the 18 millimeter rebound knob assembly. So now that both are disengaged, you can actually press both and disengage the O-rings on the lowers. So now you can completely remove the rebound knob assembly and compression rod nut. So now that we've removed the compression rod nut and the rebound knob assembly from the lowers, the uppers can now be pulled apart from the lowers. This is an important step to do in this orientation on a flat surface, on a safe surface as well, for the lowers to sit and remain as you pull the uppers away from the assembly. So now, all of the splash oil in both sides of the lowers can remain trapped between the seals and the lips of the holes on the bottom of the lowers. So now we have our uppers isolated from the lowers. Now we're really going to be focusing just on the air spring side. It's important to save the compression rod here from any sort of scratches from the wrench. So to do that, you press the equalizer system and move the piston down so that it's safe and out of the way. Now we can take a 22 millimeter wrench and loosen the air seal head. So now we've disengaged the air seal head from the stanchion, and this is going to allow us to reveal the location of where the travel spacers are housed. So you can actually pull the assembly up. And it's important to know that there's threads inside of the stanchion that could potentially harm the air piston that moves up and down. You can actually hear it. So that piston is inside here, and it's actually behind the threads. So make sure that when you're doing this travel adjustment, the piston stays inside of the stanchion. So every HELM fork that comes out of the factory as an aftermarket option is 160 millimeters of travel. So this means that there is actually a spacer housed inside the fork currently. So to remove the spacer, you want to move the bumper and white nylon washer up the compression rod to reveal the 10 millimeter spacer. So that is the 1 centimeter or 10 millimeter travel spacer that's included on the compression rod. To make this fork 170 millimeters of travel, you simply remove the spacer and then reinstall the fork. To go from 160 down to 150, the spacer is installed and you add one additional spacer. To go down to 140, you add one more spacer to the compression rod. This shortens the entire travel amount by 30 millimeters, from 170 down to 140. For this example, I'm going to be reinstalling this fork as 170 millimeters of travel. So we originally had one spacer on the compression rod, and we are simply removing this spacer. So now that we've readjusted our travel from 160 to 170, we can then reinstall the air seal head. So you push down the air seal head, and then you take the 22 millimeter wrench and retighten the air seal head. Remember, it's important to move the compression rod down so that you keep it from scraping. For proper reassembly of the air seal head, you're going to need a crow's foot torque wrench, as a 22 millimeter wrench, of course, for the air seal head, and retorque to 16 Newton meters. To 16. A very important step before reinstalling the uppers onto the lowers is to check the O-rings of both rods to make sure that there's no cuts or scrapes on the O-ring, because you do want to have a proper seal on the lower. So for example, on the damper side, I can tell that this O-ring has a slight cut in it. So we're going to replace the O-ring with one of the O-rings that comes with the package. So with the spacers that you will find in the aftermarket package, we also have extra O-rings for both sides of the fork. So now that we've inspected both O-rings on both rods, the rebound rod and the air spring rod, we can now reinstall the uppers on the lowers. A very important step is to make sure that the air spring side has about an inch to 2 inch compression. So we like to use the 2-finger rule here. Pinch at the top above a 2-finger indication and drop your compression rod down to this height. This allows the lowers and the uppers to be installed properly without having a pressure change, say a vacuum or a pressure additive in the lowers below the actual air spring. So now we've successfully installed the uppers onto the lowers. You can see that the air spring side, the compression rod, sticks out of the lower, whereas the rebound knob assembly will thread inside of the lower. So this is a healthy orientation of both rods being reinstalled into the lowers. Next step, install some blue Loctite onto the threads of the compression rod, and also onto the threads of the rebound knob assembly. Try not to get any blue Loctite on the rebound knob assembly other than the threads. Then reinstall both the rebound knob assembly and the compression rod nut. Now that both the compression rod nut and the rebound knob assembly are hand tightened, we can then take a torque wrench to both sides. The compression rod nut requires 5 Newton meters, and the rebound knob assembly requires 7 Newton meters. Now that the fork is fully reinstalled, pull the fork back to full extension. To do this properly, you press the negative equalizer button to open the port on the piston and allow air to flow from the negative chamber to the positive chamber. You pull the uppers away from the lowers until you confirm that it's back to full extension. Now, rethread the negative air chamber so that the air can be isolated between the negative and positive air spring properly. and reinstall the protective cap. Now the fork is completely ready to be reinstalled on your bike with your new travel adjustment. So now that the fork is back on the bike, here's a pro tip on how to equalize the atmospheric pressure in your fork's lowers. So I have a simple zip tie here, and we're going to affect both sides of the lowers because air can be trapped in both sides, regardless of air spring or damper side. So the simplest way to do this, move the seal up with your thumb just slightly so that the zip tie can freely move right into the seal, and you push the zip tie down until you feel a hard bottom out. So this is allowing air through the seal and allowing air to equalize in the atmospheric pressure here down into the lowers. So the same has to be done on the air spring side as well. Thanks for watching. For more great tips, visit canecreek.com or on YouTube at Cane Creek Cycling.